Hi, my name is James. I'm a recent convert from Protestantism to Catholicism. So during my conversion process, I studied enough to kind of feel that I must convert, but that doesn't mean I sort of mastered all the fundamental teachings. So right now what I'm doing is going kind of back through and digging deeper. So I'm reading this book right now, Not by Scripture Alone, because one of the kind of, if you look at maybe the core three or so, one of the main differences are the approaches to Scripture and Revelation in general. So Protestants have Sola Scriptura, which means Scripture alone. Catholics have Scripture, tradition, and magisterium. So it's a decent-sized book, and it'll take a while to work through until I can make a video summarizing it. So I thought, there's a lot of meaty subjects, and it's probably worth at least pulling this video out before I do the full Sola Scriptura review. So let me go ahead and just read you a section from the book. This is page 41. So speaking of the Catholic Church here, no matter how far afield her most vocal and dissident theologians have strayed, she has stood by her magisterial definitions of what is to be believed of faith. After all, whose voice is it that, as the spiritual leader of nearly 1/5 of the earth's recalcitrant inhabitants, still dares to condemn as sin the commonplace practices of contraception, masturbation, abortion, divorce, remarriage, homosexuality, and to retain an uncompromising view of Scripture and insist on an exclusively male and celibate clergy? The voice of the Pope. Where else do you hear such a voice? From Canterbury? Lutheranism? Presbyterianism? Methodism? Evangelicalism? All of Rome's official teaching and reasoning is based directly or indirectly on the Bible, so I'll defend that in the next video. Even her position on celibacy. Further, with the exception of celibacy, Protestantism traditionally shared Rome's view of all of these practices, including contraception. Yet contemporary Protestant teaching has, to one degree or another, relinquished its traditional positions and sought rationalizations for more permissive views, even in evangelical circles. So let me give you two examples from my own life, and the first one is actually covered in a footnote, so I'll read that first. The evangelical author Charles Proven, in The Bible and Birth Control, explores not only biblical arguments against birth control, but the arguments of prominent Protestant theologians from the Protestant reformers to the 19th century for opposing birth control. In fact, no Protestant denomination sanctioned contraception prior to the 1930s, when the Episcopal Church became the first to officially go on record permitting birth control. So years ago, before I even thought about becoming Catholic, I learned that. So I was Anglican at the time. And it was fairly startling, actually. You have those things in life that happen that kind of like shake you, like what's going on? Because I was Protestant for 44 years, and it never occurred to me that the church would take a position on contraception. And obviously you can't kill your kid, right? But beyond that, you kind of do what you want. So to learn that not only did the church have an official position, but it had one until very recently that I didn't even have a grid for. So it's like, what the heck? And so the second example I'll use is from an Aaron Renn article. So if you don't know, he's like a prominent evangelical social commentator. So he wrote an article about the definition of manhood and womanhood. And in the article, he talks about how a group of evangelical scholars and leaders got together and tried to write like a position statement on manhood. Like, what is a man? What are his roles? And the punchline is that they weren't able to, because they didn't know. I mean, they came up with a list of like statements, 1, 2, 3, but they're all like empty phrases or circular statements and things like that. So you think about it, and it's like, well, how would they know, really? Our culture, it's not really fashionable to differentiate or to really home in on manhood or womanhood, because we're supposed to be kind of interchangeable, besides, some small biological differences that are insignificant, And so you wouldn't expect them to be able to write a decent position paper. But, on the other hand, has the church ever thought about what a man is and what a man's roles are? Or what a woman is and what her roles are? Of course she has, which is really the punchline here. So let's change topics to worldview formation. So think about how we get our picture of the world. So over the centuries, there's been debates about whether do we come out or are we born as sort of or conceived as blank slates, or do we have propensities that are somewhat set at birth? And I think the latter has won, basically. At least that's my take. And so we come out as kind of leading with feelings or reason, or maybe we're introverted or extroverted, and so on. And then we have experiences in the world. We receive an education, we make decisions, things happen to us that kind of shape how we view the world. Now let's think about perspective. So there's the parable about the blind man and the elephant. So each man is kind of feeling around in this thing and describing what he feels, and yet each person's experiences is completely different. So that's an example where the perspective is accurate but limited. But for the purposes of this video, I want to talk about where the perspective is false. So think about maybe looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, for example, or you're watching a movie and you change the color settings. So these are examples of distorted perspectives where you're not seeing what's actually there. And of course that's most relevant to morality, because it's not like we have an incomplete picture, we do, but the main problem is that our reality has become distorted. So we have schools that are giving us maybe bad education. We've got TV shows where it's the people writing it are directly aiming towards some bad social goal. So you think about maybe Will and Grace, popularizing homosexuality. So I'm old enough to remember before then when it was universally considered bad, and now you can get fired for saying something like that, and that wasn't that long ago. There was Murphy Brown in the 80s where that was a controversial show because she was a single mother, and so people didn't want to promote that, and yet we wouldn't even flinch nowadays about that. Now of course there's social media, there's movies, there's music. I think of the example in my high school where we're a bunch of good Christian kids. Eminem comes along, and all of a sudden, kids at graduation are tattooed, things like that. So the result is that, there's all these influences that shape how we view the world. Some of them give us a more holistic, accurate perspective, but a whole lot of them lead us to false views. So frequently, the Bible compares us to sheep in the Old Testament and the New. And if you know anything about sheep, that's a fairly humbling comparison, because sheep are stupid. But frankly, the older I get, the more accurate and literal I believe that is. So, if you've paid attention the last 5-6 years of political discussions, you realize that people will believe anything at all, that their leaders or their tribe tells them to believe. So you can think, of transgenderism as an example. I don't need to give a bunch of examples, but there's just one. Like a parent might say, I really want to mutilate my child. And you're like, well, why do you want to mutilate your child? And it's like, well, my political leader told me to. Now, you're not going to have that conversation. They'll try to give real views, but that's actually what's happening. Their political tribe is telling them to mutilate their child. And so they're like, yes, I will mutilate my child. Now, that's an extreme example, but that's a very human thing to do. So what we humans really need is we need a Christ-appointed group that can hold the line over centuries and millennia on morality, that can tell us what's right and wrong, right? Because, okay, we've got scripture, but I'm going to read this with my perspective and with my bad perspective. I'm going to see things based on my experience of the world, and it's going to distort how I interpret the infallible writings of Scripture. And so, again, what we need is an infallible interpreter that ideally, it would be really nice if we had records for, say all the way back 2,000 years, to hear what to read or learn what their discussions were, what their reasoning was, what their experiences were. And of course, that's the Catholic Church. And so the title of this video, is how the traditional Christianity is the guardian of morality. And that's because it is. That's the only guardian we have. That's what Christ has appointed for us. And so that's why I recommend the Catholic Church, and the best group of Catholics I know of as far as living out this is the Society of St. Pius X, or the SSPX. So that's why I attend an SSPX parish, and why I think you should too. So I think that's enough for this video. As I said, maybe in 3-4 weeks I'll come out with a kind of longer Sola Scriptura video. But until then, God bless.